a royal cradle and a furious king, two nations balanced on a single marriage proposal, one side demanding the union of crowns, the other choosing blood over bondage. This is the story of two battles that broke a nation, all because a king demanded a bride. It began in the freezing mud of Solway Moss, where 15,000 Scots surrendered to 3,000 English without lifting a sword, but that humiliation was just the prologue. 5 years later, Scotland would face a new enemy, a military machine built for the future, armed with firepower they couldn't answer. This is the rough wooing, the war for a cradle that ended with Black Saturday. The battle was over before it began. Not with a shout, but with the sound of sinking boots and the gurgle of a river swallowing a collapsing army. November 1542. The air across the Anglo-Scottish border was a miserable mix of ice and rain, a perfect setting for a historical disaster. For years, the two kingdoms had been locked in a low, vicious dance of border raids and escalating insults. Henry VIII, the fat king who changed his own religion, demanded his nephew James V do the same. James, with his French Catholic loyalty, told him no. This wasn't about God, it was about pride. By the autumn of 1542, Henry had run out of patience. He unleashed an army on the Scottish borders, forcing James to retaliate. The plan was a large-scale invasion of England, a hammer blow to secure the border once and for all. But James was a king whose popularity was largely confined to the common people and the clergy. His nobles, nursing old grudges over his centralized power and his favoritism toward his own men, were seething. The stage was set not for a military victory, but for a political implosion. As the Scottish army, estimated at around 15,000 men, advanced on the western border, the deep rot at its heart became exposed. James himself, physically ill and possibly fearing a noble coup, did not lead the army. Instead, he handed command to men he trusted, his court favorites. The ancient, territorial Scottish nobility, the men who truly commanded the border clans, were humiliated. They had been ordered to follow men they considered upstarts and sycophants. When the time came to cross the border and engage a smaller English force, many of the leading nobles simply refused to advance, citing their feudal duty to follow only the king in person. The result was less a battle and more a psychological collapse. On the 24th of November, near a stretch of boggy, tidal estuary known as Solway Moss, the Scottish force descended into chaos. The troops, confused and leaderless, began to retreat toward the river Esk. This was no disciplined withdrawal, it was a confused, frightened mob streaming toward the marshes, their formations dissolved by the mutual distrust of their commanders. As they funneled toward the river, a small English force of perhaps 3,000 men, realizing the utter confusion of their enemy, pressed their advantage. They didn't have to fight, they only had to push. The mud of Solway Moss became a swallowing tomb. Hundreds of Scots drowned in the rising tide, or were captured struggling through the thick bog. The surrender was a national disgrace. Thousands of Scottish soldiers and dozens of prominent nobles, including 2 earls, were taken captive by a tiny English army, often yielding to men armed with nothing more than a sword and a borderer's instinct. The sheer, naked humiliation of the defeat, a great army undone by its own politics, and a few English horsemen was total. But the tragedy of the king was about to eclipse the tragedy of the battlefield. The news of the rout travelled fast, reaching James V as he lay sick in Falkland Palace. The shock and shame were overwhelming. His grand design to strike at England had been turned into a political mockery by his own lords. He descended into a deep, consuming despair, reportedly speaking only a few words in his final days. On the 14th of December, 1542, the King of Scots died, heartbroken and defeated. He left behind a kingdom paralyzed by defeat and, critically, an heir only 6 days old, a girl. His final, famously mournful words captured the tragedy of the moment. "It can wi' lass, it will gang wi' lass." With the infant Mary, Queen of Scots, resting in her cradle, the Scottish throne had never been weaker, and 200 miles south, the Lion of England smelled blood, a crown balanced on a child's head. The Scottish throne had never been weaker, and 200 miles south, the Lion of England smelled blood. Henry VIII didn't want a battle, he wanted a bride. The disaster at Solway Moss had created a political vacuum that Henry VIII was determined to fill. The young Queen Mary was now the ultimate prize, and her marriage would determine the future of Great Britain. Henry's goal was simple, ruthless, and historically ambitious. He wanted Mary to marry his own 9-year-old son, Prince Edward, thereby uniting the crowns of England and Scotland under a single, Protestant dynasty. This was the wooing. It was a geopolitical maneuver designed to win by marriage what his armies had failed to win by conquest. To push his agenda, Henry released the high-ranking Scottish nobles captured at Solway Moss, sending them back to Edinburgh, stuffed with English gold and promises. This group, known as the Assured Lords, formed a powerful pro-English faction in the Scottish Parliament. Against them stood the Francophile Catholic faction, led by Cardinal David Beaton, a fiercely proud and politically astute man who knew that a marriage alliance with England would mean the end of Scottish independence and the destruction of the Catholic Church in Scotland. The weak and conflicted regent of Scotland, James Hamilton, the Earl of Arran, was initially swayed by the English promises of peace and the return of the Scottish nobles. In July of 1543, he signed the Treaty of Greenwich, which stipulated that Mary would marry Edward when they came of age. This appeared, for a brief moment, to be the diplomatic victory Henry sought. However, the treaty's fine print contained clauses that preserved some degree of Scottish sovereignty, which Henry, with his usual tyrannical impatience, almost immediately tried to undermine. The treaty had barely been signed before a massive, popular backlash erupted across Scotland. The common people and the vast majority of the nobles saw Henry's demands not as a proposal, but as a thinly veiled demand for political submission. For centuries, the Scots had fiercely guarded their independence. They had traded in French ports, fought alongside French kings, and looked to the French for cultural and military support. To abandon this, to hand their queen and their destiny to the man who had just humiliated them at Solway Moss, was unthinkable. Cardinal Beaton, capitalizing on this national fury, quickly outmaneuvered the weak Arran. The Scottish Parliament, fueled by patriotic rage and religious conviction, swiftly and decisively annulled the Treaty of Greenwich in December of 1543. They had chosen blood over bondage. The news of the annulment sent Henry VIII into a monumental, terrifying rage. His diplomatic wooing had been rejected, and his pride was wounded on the grandest scale. He decreed that if Scotland would not willingly consent to the marriage, he would force it. He declared a new war, a campaign of terror and deliberate destruction designed not to conquer, but to inflict such pain and damage that the Scottish people would be compelled, by ruin and famine, to submit to his will. This minor act of sabotage would cost Scotland everything, because the Scots, united by fury, were about to tell Henry no. This was the moment the rough wooing officially began. Henry gave the command to his general, Edward Seymour, the Earl of Hertford, to execute the campaign. The orders were chillingly simple: lay waste to the land, burn, and destroy. If you have a thought about which Scottish leader should have taken command before Solway Moss, let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your historical take. Henry was dead, but the crown was in the hands of the man who burned Scotland to the ground. Somerset would not negotiate, he would demand. And to enforce his demand, he prepared an army that was, by all measures, the most technologically lethal force Europe had ever seen. This was not warfare. This was terrorism by decree. The English banners did not bring terms of surrender. They brought one single command: burn. From the Forth to the borders, Scotland was about to learn the meaning of rough wooing. The Earl of Hertford took Henry VIII's ruthless mandate and executed it with cold, terrifying precision. The campaign of 1544 was not aimed at strategic conquest, but at breaking the Scottish will to resist. The explicit orders were to destroy every manor house, every tower, every village, and every town that resisted, to sow chaos, and to ensure that the Scottish people suffered in a way they had never experienced. Hertford was the first modern general to wage a calculated war on the civilian population to achieve a political end. In May of 1544, an English invasion force landed at Leith. Hertford's primary target was Scotland's beating heart, Edinburgh. After a brief resistance, the city fell. For 3 days, English troops systematically sacked and burned the capital. The great high kirk of St. Giles was looted, the palace of Holyrood House was set ablaze, and the surrounding towns and villages were reduced to ash. Hertford's chroniclers proudly recorded the staggering scale of the devastation, including the calculated destruction of food sources and farmland to ensure future famine. Over the next 3 years, Hertford's armies conducted punishing raids that earned him the title of the Scourge of Fire. The aim was to make Scotland uninhabitable. Historic abbeys Melrose, Jedburgh, Dryburgh were systematically ruined, and countless churches and castles were torched. This campaign of deliberate cruelty had a counterproductive effect. Instead of forcing the Scots to hand over their queen, it stiffened their resolve, uniting the Scottish factions in a deep, burning hatred for the English. The French, alarmed by the total collapse of their Scottish allies, began to provide desperately needed financial and military aid, which helped the Scots secure a few minor victories, momentarily stemming the tide of fire. The rough wooing, however, remained a war of attrition that Scotland was losing by inches and acres. In 1546, a dramatic event occurred that marked the climax of the Catholic resistance, the assassination of Cardinal Beaton. He was murdered by a group of Protestant nobles who seized his fortress, St. Andrew's Castle. This internal conflict briefly diverted Scottish attention, but did little to slow the external threat. The war's devastating momentum finally paused in January of 1547. Henry VIII, the architect of the chaos, died. For the Scots, it was a moment of profound, if brief, relief. The great tyrant was gone. Many believed the war would end, or at least subside, but they were tragically mistaken. The crown of England passed to the young King Edward VI, and the power behind the throne was now held by the boy's uncle, Edward Seymour, the man who had ordered the fires, the Earl of Hertford. Now elevated to the Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector of England, Somerset would not retreat. He would demand total victory. He had seen what fire could do. Now he was ready to show Scotland what gunpowder and steel could do. To achieve it, he prepared an army that was, by all measures, the most technologically lethal force Europe had ever seen. The Protector Somerset was a man of cold, calculated ambition. Unlike Henry VIII, who could be swayed by whim and fury, Somerset had a clear, professional military objective: to end the rough wooing with a single, devastating, and decisive blow. He understood that a sustained war of occupation was too expensive and too difficult. He needed a victory so absolute it would force the Scottish Parliament to the negotiating table permanently. In the summer of 1547, Somerset assembled his Grand Army. It was a force of around 18,000 men, formidable in its size, but truly revolutionary in its composition. This was not a medieval army, it was a military machine built for the future. He brought professional German and Italian mercenaries skilled in pike warfare, a large contingent of well-drilled heavy cavalry, and, crucially, a staggering number of Hagbutter's infantry armed with the new, powerful gunpowder weapon, the arquebus. This army had firepower and maneuverability that its Scottish counterparts simply lacked. The Scottish army, commanded by Regent Arran, was assembled to meet this threat. It was a massive host, numbering perhaps 30,000 men, dwarfing the English in sheer manpower. The bulk of this force was composed of the Scottish levies, fierce and determined but poorly disciplined and even more poorly equipped for modern warfare. Their central strategy relied on the ancient national formation, the schiltron, a massive, densely packed block of pikemen, a tactic that had won them victory at Bannockburn centuries earlier. Against swords and bows, the schiltron was a fortress. Against gunpowder, it was a massive, immobile target. By early September, the two armies faced each other near the Firth of Forth. The Scots took a strong defensive position, digging in on the hills overlooking the River Esk, with the sea to their left. They were confident in their numbers and their high ground. However, in a fatal, inexplicable strategic blunder, Regent Arran ordered his entire massive army to descend from the safety of the hills and cross the Esk, moving their position to ground much closer to the sea. The move was likely intended to prevent the English from outflanking them, but it accomplished the opposite. By moving his army into the open and closer to the water, Arran exposed his flank to an enemy he barely considered a threat, the English fleet. The night before the battle was tense. The Scots, positioned on the plain, were convinced their numerical superiority would crush the invaders. They were ready for a battle of pikes and steel. Sharing this history helps keep these incredible stories alive. If you know someone who loves military history, please share this video with them. They were ready for the past. They had no idea they were about to face a firing line built from the future. They came not from the front, but from the flank. Not from the land, but from the sea. The first volley was not an attack, it was a sentence. The Scots had faced armies before. They had never faced a firing line built from the future. The morning of Saturday, the 10th of September, 1547, dawned on the fields of Pinkie Cleugh. The English, led by Somerset, saw the staggering mass of the Scottish army, the largest Scotland had fielded in centuries, now deployed on the flat ground near the river. Somerset's reaction was one of professional disbelief, quickly followed by cold opportunity. The first blow of the battle was delivered by the English navy. As the Scottish army shifted its position, its entire left flank was brought within range of the English galleys moored in the Firth of Forth. The ships opened fire, unleashing a cannonade of heavy shot and smaller, explosive projectiles. The dense, undisciplined Scottish ranks were pulverized by the unexpected fire from the sea. The shelling caused immediate casualties, but its effect on morale was catastrophic. Whole formations were disrupted, their will to fight shattered by the realization that their commanders had placed them in a vulnerable trap. Next, Somerset unleashed his light cavalry to test the Scottish centre. The Scots, adhering to the Skiltron tradition, repelled the initial cavalry charge with their pikes. But the maneuver had served its purpose. It drew the Scottish centre forward and fixed their position, making them an even better target. The deciding factor was the combination of the English artillery and the hagbutters. The heavy English field guns opened fire, smashing cannonballs into the tightly packed Scottish squares. The schiltrons, designed to repel cavalry, proved helpless against the relentless, long-range bombardment. Men were ripped apart, and the formation's discipline began to fray under the pressure of technology they could not answer. As the Scottish ranks began to waver, Somerset ordered the full advance. The English army moved forward in a disciplined, coordinated line. The arquebusiers unleashed volley after volley of terrifying, smoking fire, pouring shot into the demoralized and disordered Scottish pikes. The engagement was brief, brutal, and utterly one-sided. The English advanced using a combined arms approach, while the Scots, their only answer being their unwieldy pikes, were systematically broken. The battle quickly degenerated into a complete, horrifying rout. The Scottish infantry threw down their weapons and fled en masse, not toward their rear, but toward the open country, trying to escape the murderous fire. The English cavalry, previously repelled, now had their target, thousands of unarmed, fleeing men. The pursuit was a massacre. The English horsemen rode down the terrified Scots for miles, their orders simple: show no mercy. The River Esk reportedly ran red with blood. The Scottish losses were staggering. Perhaps 6,000 Scots died in the fighting and the subsequent slaughter, compared to a few hundred English casualties. The battle was a masterclass in modern military efficiency and a tragedy for Scotland. Pinkie Cleugh was immediately christened Black Saturday. The battle had destroyed the main Scottish army and military capacity for a generation. Though the diplomatic goal was never achieved, Mary, Queen of Scots, was quickly smuggled to France and betrothed to the Dauphin. Ensuring the continuation of the French alliance, the two battles of Solway Moss and Pinkie Cleugh left Scotland crippled. The rough wooing was a military success for England, costing Scotland thousands of lives and plunging the kingdom into decades of weakness and strife. The war for a cradle was lost, but Scottish independence had been bought with a terrible, bloody price. If you want to see more stories about the incredible battles that shaped our world, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments what piece of history you think deserves to be told next.